Morning, everybody. Welcome to Green Alliance's post-election debrief. What now for the environment? Apologies for the technical hitch at the beginning, but we've got 55 minutes to discuss what the election means for the environment. I'm just talking relatively slowly while people join the call. We've got four great speakers to discuss the issues. If you want to tweet about it, please use the hashtag GA event. The election is over. We have a new government with a strong majority that was elected on probably the most ambitious environmental manifesto of any government that's yet been elected in the UK. And I think there's reason to feel pretty hopeful. We've also got a phalanx of new Lib Dem and Green MPs who will be pushing for action on the environment. And Keir Starmer has, perhaps slightly unusually, put in place a whole team of ministers who both know their briefs and care about the issues that they're in charge of. So there's a lot to feel hopeful about. We're going to explore various policy issues. Libby Peake is going to talk about the circular economy and resources. Liam Hardy is going to talk about climate and energy. And Lydia Collis is going to talk about nature and land use. And we'll have a bit of a panel discussion and then we'll open it up to questions. So please, if you want to ask a question, don't use the chat function. Please use the Q&A function. But I want to start by just talking about how civil society and the NGO sector should approach this new government that is committed to a lot of the things that we stand for. And there's an interesting passage in Tony Blair's memoirs, which I'm sure you've all read avidly. Tony Blair says there, over time, I'm afraid I came to dislike part of the NGO culture, especially the green groups, because their entire raison d'etre is to get policy changed. They can hardly say, yes, we've done it, putting themselves out of business. Balance is not in their vocabulary. It's all outrage, betrayal, and crisis. Now, certainly that's not my experience of working in NGOs. I think we try really hard to work with governments. We're sometimes desperate to find things to praise. We're quite often accused of being co-opted by government. But nevertheless, there is at times in the UK NGO sector quite a sort of edgy sense, particularly when we're outside the tent, that we find ourselves beating up the governments, whether we like it or not. And we've now got a government with a 5-year mandate that's going to be in place for a long time, which is trying to achieve a lot of the things that we're trying to achieve, but will no doubt go slower than we want and disappoint in various ways. And I just want to ask Holly, how do you think as a sector we should be approaching this new government?
It's a fairly big question. And I think you raise, many very valid points. I think ultimately everyone does accept that we as a sector are going to have to change the way that we work, and a new balance is going to have to be struck. So arguably that would be true at any change in the party of government. And I think central to it working in the future is recognition from both parties that actually they need us and we need them. Because while they have stood up on this very bold, kind of climate agenda, a lot of that has been informed by the work of the sector. And I think we can take real pride in that, and that our aim should be to continue the spirit of co-working that we've had in recent years in helping the smaller parties and opposition parties develop their manifestos. I think probably the question for the sector is how we reach that consensus after an election. It is going to be a step change. And I think that striking the balance about both being robust about where we don't think they're doing well enough, but also recognizing the things that you just said, Tony Blair said, about getting better at celebrating when governments are doing well, and when we are, when things happen that we are proud of and we see our role in how that came about. I think that is a really important thing, and often that can struggle to cut through, and it won't be picked up in media and that kind of thing. So it naturally doesn't cut through as well. I think early indications are that the new government are receptive to ideas, and ultimately I think it is a huge opportunity for the sector, and that's the thing that that's kind of the place we should be starting from, and that our priority should be in making sure we as a sector are joined up in our approaches in the most strategic and impactful way. On the broader politics point, I think one of the factors to consider as part of that is that the government have got a massive majority. They've come in to a huge majority that then means we are moving away from the tight votes that we've seen in recent years, and they are going to be able to do most of what they want. We need to work out how we're going to be part of that and maximise the opportunities that might come. And that might not be in the next 6 months as they kind of crack on with their core agenda as they've laid it out in the manifesto, but it certainly will be in the years to come. In thinking about that, it's really important, I think, to look at the kind of seats that the Labour Party won, because I think it's really important to remember that they've gained a lot of seats where they didn't necessarily expect to. And they now have huge numbers of seats in rural areas where they haven't traditionally been popular. And nationally, the seats vary hugely between who came in second at the election. So there's now a vast swathe of seats where the Greens came second, but there's also a vast swathe where Reform came second. And the pressure that the MPs in those seats will feel is going to vary hugely. And that's a really important thing for us to remember in terms of where they're coming from and the pressures that you might see in terms of new government. And I think realistically, that is going to come out as individual issues come to a head. And for us, that's going to be over things like planning, and it's going to be on things like energy infrastructure and where we put pylons and what happens in rural versus urban areas of the country. And I think that is the political challenge for us. If you just allow me to take a step back a little bit in terms of the bigger picture of the election, more generally, I think a lot of people have argued that it has not been a climate election, as particularly compared to ones that we've seen in the past. But I think it would be fair to say that actually central to Labour's policy platform this time around was extensive action on decarbonising the energy system, investing in clean technology, no new oil and gas licenses. And while the media didn't necessarily always run with that side of it, and it always goes back to the energy security angle because that's what cuts through with the public, I think it is actually indisputable that fairly bold and, rapid action on the transition was in the mix. And the lack of confrontation over climate in things like the leaders' debates, I hope, reflect the lack of contestation around environmental protection amongst the public. So I think just really quickly on what we've seen so far from a new government, we're 1 week in and we've pretty much seen what we expected. So it's basically a new government intent on growth. There aren't many governments in recent years that haven't been intent on that at the beginning, but I think the difference is that we are seeing one where it's underpinned by green growth. And, in a week, we've already seen the unblocking of the onshore wind ban, the launching of the National Wealth Fund, a focus on devolution and decentralisation, and the importance of that. And I think they would argue that they've hit the ground running on major issues like, public sector strikes, industrial decarb, particularly Port Talbot, and state of the waterways, that kind of thing, as well as some big appointments like Chris Stark to chair the Energy Mission Board. I think where we sit right now is that there are still really big questions to answer. So there are massive things like what does GB Energy actually look like? They've been talking about it for a few years, and I don't think there has been any consensus on necessarily what that actually looks like going forward. There are also questions for us over how they're going to close the biggest emission gaps, which we know is in transport in the years to come. What's the plan? And then also things like, the resources, how are they going to reach statutory nature targets? And I think they are only a weekend, don't get me wrong, and the in-tray is absolutely ginormous. So I think probably my top line conclusion is that actually we do have a lot to be quite hopeful about, and we probably do have more than we expected to have had in a week's time. But I think probably it's fairly safe to say that we should be excited about what's ahead. We just need to think about how we can engage in the most strategic and impactful way.
Great, thanks, Holly. And we're going to return to some of those points later. Can I just ask a follow-up? Is how do we deal with the opposition parties, particularly the Conservatives, who I would say have got a proud record on the environment, but kind of stood against that record to a certain extent and may now be going into a fractious leadership contest, and Reform, whose voters don't appear to be half as sceptical about net zero and climate action as their leaders? I mean, how do we engage with those parties?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point. I think that I mean, starting with the Conservatives and where they are now, obviously there is a leadership change that will happen in the coming months, and that what we need to make sure is that actually climate does not become again the culture war issue that dictates that. And I think the change in MPs, actually, there's now a huge number of the Conservative MPs that are left in Parliament have connections to the Conservative Environment Network and have backgrounds in really caring about, you know, nature and environmental issues. And I think we need to really empower them to feel like it's like they have a very important role to play in opposition, to make sure that Labour are considering things that might be important more in Conservative seats. And I think they really should not be written off by civil society and NGOs more broadly, that we really still need to engage and make sure that what happens in 5 years' time with the next election, that we are in a much more positive place and we don't see it as a culture war issue. And I think the reform point plays into that. Obviously, there are reform MPs in Parliament, and it's yet to be seen where they will direct their energies, I think, in Parliament. But central to that, actually, for us, needs to remain that the people that voted reform, you know, consistent polling showed before the election that they were not voting reform because of their stance on net zero. They were voting reform for a number of other issues, including immigration and feeling left behind and a general distrust in politics. And what we need to do is make sure that we empower the Green voices and the Lib Dems, who are just going to be so incredibly important after the next election. There are so many more of them, and the power to hold the Labour Party to account in government is going to be absolutely massive. So I think despite the massive majority, everyone should really see the value in bolstering and feel like helping opposition parties to feel incredibly confident on the environmental agenda.
Great, thanks, Holly. Let's turn now to Libby and resources and the circular economy. And I think probably in previous years, doing an election wrap-up, we wouldn't have started with the circular economy, but we have a Secretary of State who appears to be mustard keen to get going on the circular economy, which has been a bit of a Cinderella issue. And there is a line in the Labour manifesto committing to moving in a more circular direction. It's only one line, but it is more than there's been before. Libby, how hopeful are you that we will see real change now on resources in the circular economy?
Well, you'll be glad to hear that I am incredibly hopeful. I do think that this is genuinely a moment where we might achieve some momentum and some change. The Labour manifesto was a 27,000-word document, roughly. But the only 2 words that I wanted to see were circular economy, and those were in there. And I think that was a really important point for us and something that you can hang a lot onto. And the reason that the phrase circular economy in particular was really important was because although it's a wonky phrase, although it's not necessarily something that's very well understood by the public, it's something that encompasses a lot of really important things around the way that the economy functions and the way that we use resources. So at Green Alliance, we tend to envisage it as a series of concentric circles where you keep materials in use at their highest value for as long as possible. So recycling's on the outside. You do want to have recycling. You do want to treat waste correctly at the end of life by recycling it. But more important than that are reuse, repair, and remanufacturing. And at the center of that concentric circle, we tend to see reduction. That's the most important thing. It should be seen as a bullseye. Now, it's not entirely clear from the Labour manifesto if they're viewing it as a bullseye that the aim is to reduce waste. But all signs, as you say, Shaun, do point to the fact that we have a new Secretary of State who is genuinely impassioned and genuinely enthusiastic about the circular economy. And he's correctly identified that it offers win after win in terms of what it can do for not only the environment, but also for society and crucially for the economy with a new government that's focused on growth. And it was really quite telling that in the first video that he put out, after being appointed, his second priority, only second to dealing with the sewage trouble, which is perfectly understandable, was a roadmap to a zero waste economy. And I think the key thing to getting that right is going to be expanding our understanding of what waste is, because previous administrations have said really good things. They've had the right aims when it comes to waste and resources. The previous government promised to minimize waste and maximize resources, and they said all of the right things and had the right framing. And then when it came down to it, they sort of got trapped in the cycle of just thinking of end of life solutions, of getting minor changes through in the grand scheme of things. So important changes when it came to packaging are underway, but that's only a small part of what resources are and what resources can achieve. And I think what we want to see from this government and what we want to help Steve Reed and everyone else who's impassioned about the circular economy do is to really make this part of a cross-governmental mission to drive the circular economy. So you're going to need buy-in from a lot of different departments to ensure that this succeeds. And we're really keen that people like the Ministry of Housing, Government, Communities and Local Government gets on board, because they're in charge of housing. And if Labour has a really strong house building mission, if you're looking at how materials are used currently, the sort of carbon intensity of materials, if we don't change how we build houses and make it more circular, could sort of bust our entire carbon budget. And so that needs to be thought of. They also have the sort of planning levers, so they're important to be involved there as well. But you've also got, obviously, DESNZ, who needs to be involved, because waste and resources isn't sort of separate to the climate crisis. They are key to driving it. And globally, the UN is quite strong in pointing out that resource extraction and processing drives 55% of global emissions, as well as 90% of biodiversity loss. So DESNZ absolutely has to be involved. And HMT definitely needs to be involved as well, who have traditionally sort of been seen as a blocker to this, but they could change things drastically by making adjustments to the tax system, which currently favors linear practices, and also looking at how financial risk is considered, because linear business models do have a lot of risk to them. And the Green Finance Institute has been very strong in pointing out that actually the hit that GDP could take from problems with UK supply chains could actually be bigger than that which we experienced with COVID. So unless we're treating the linear business models as the risk that they are, we could really see some damage to the growth agenda. And so I think, to avoid the pitfalls that previous governments have seen, we'd really like some cross-governmental working, whether that's through a joint ministerial task force or a joint unit. It remains to be seen, but definitely getting everybody else on board and spreading Steve Reed's enthusiasm will be key.
Great, thank you, Libby. And you anticipated all my planned follow-up questions. I'm going to move straight to Liam now to talk about energy and climate. And Liam, we've got probably in Miliband and his team of ministers the most committed and knowledgeable leadership in this area that we've ever had. And we've got high ambition. I think 2030 power decarbonisation. A lot of people, even in the environment sector, are questioning whether that can really be done. Are you confident that the government can deliver both Ed Miliband's energy aims, but also more broadly get back on track to delivering net zero?
Thanks, Shaun. I suppose the first question is, has any government ever delivered on all of its ambitions? Perhaps not, but there's certainly lots of challenges. But I think it's right to be hopeful about it, as you say. So obviously, we're really excited to see a government that's championing climate action and immediately appointing people like Chris Stark as the chair of the mission control for clean power that Holly mentioned earlier, which is excellent. And similarly, the appointment of people like Sir Patrick Vallance as well to the ministerial team, someone with experience of the pace and scale of activity in the middle of the pandemic and the vaccine task force approach. That sort of appointment is essential. And again, the kind of immediate repeal of the onshore wind ban was excellent news, alongside all sorts of ambitions and positive messages in the manifesto. So, for example, the pledge to end North Sea oil and gas licenses is clearly a critical step. I think there will be calls for them to go further and prevent all new developments, but it's a great start. And the other thing that's good to see is Labour's positive messaging on the UK's role on the global stage in terms of climate leadership as well, and that's really encouraging. And then lastly, as you said yourself, there's a huge influx of new MPs who are passionate about climate politics, not just in the Labour Party, but in the Lib Dems, and of course the 4 new Green MPs as well. So we should welcome all of those warmly to Westminster, and I think lots of things to be excited about. but as we say, plenty of challenges as well. And I think Holly mentioned this too, but lots of excitement around GB energy, but a little bit of uncertainty about exactly what it will look like and what it will do. So will it be a step towards nationalising some aspects of the energy system? Will it crowd in investment into existing renewable technologies, or will it be a vehicle to specifically deploy other technologies that are sort of clean, flexible, but not the classic wind and solar that the private sector is kind of already getting on with? So that's a big question to watch out for. I think the next big test for Miliband and his team will be this current round of the contracts for difference, the sixth auction round, which I think this month they'll have an opportunity to increase the budget of the auction. So will they do that sufficiently to turn this into to sort of turn the corner from last year's totally failed auction round, particularly on offshore wind? So that's a big question. And of course, as I said, energy isn't just about renewables. There's a big question about how we make sure bits of the energy system that often don't get overlooked. So whether that's on demand reduction and demand side flexibility, but also, as I say, that kind of those other technologies that plug the gap when it's less windy and less sunny. So energy storage and maybe hydrogen power as well. So lots of questions there. And then of course, climate isn't just all about energy, and the Green Alliance policy tracker showed clearly that we're quite off track in a number of areas, especially in transport and in buildings. I think we've seen positive noises coming from the new government on transport. Lots of talk about revitalising public transport and decarbonising it, but I think there will be tougher questions coming down the line on things like curbing aviation growth and questions around road pricing as well. So lots to watch out for there. And heating buildings is a really difficult area. I think, unlike, say, electric vehicles, electrifying home heating is easier said than done. I think there are challenges with the streamlining of installations and kind of an understandable pushback from all of those who have a stake in the existing gas network. So again, more stuff to figure out there and for us to help the government work through. And then just on industry, obviously the kind of dreadful handling of the situation in Port Talbot, both by Tata and by the previous government, I think leave the new government with a thorny problem. But there are many other industries that also need help to decarbonise, and I think a green industrial strategy is absolutely vital, and there'll be lots and lots of voices with lots of different views on what that should look like. But I hope the government can steer through that to a positive vision. And finally, I just want to mention a topic that I work closely on, but is also easily overlooked, and that's on methane emissions. I hope the government's ambition to portray the UK as kind of being back in business on global climate leadership means that it will want to demonstrate that at COP29 in November. And, we're asking them to publish a national methane action plan to meet part of our commitment under the Global Methane Pledge. So that will be another one we'll be watching out for. And finally, just to say, like, so many of these questions require cross-government working, and so I think the government's mission-driven approach is fantastic to see. But one thing for us to keep an eye on is whether the clean energy mission is also a climate mission more broadly, and maybe that's a question for yourself, Shaun, and maybe Holly. But I totally understand the focus on energy for the election messaging. So let's see whether that mission is actually broad enough to encompass some of those other areas that aren't energy. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Lynn. That's a very good last question, and it's clearly a huge in-trade. Can I just follow up one thing? And it's probably a big question requiring a shortish answer, but to get to 2030 power decarbonisation, is it going to be necessary to bulldoze planning, or can you carry people with you?
Yeah, I think that's the question of the year, isn't it, Shaun? And everyone's going to have different views. It's an incredibly ambitious timeline, isn't it? And there'll be a huge amount to do. But I think that, to me, that's why that question of demand reduction and demand side flexibility is so critical, that we can't overlook that, because the more that we empower homes and businesses and industry to reduce its electricity demand or energy demand overall, the less big that whole system needs to be, and the less new pylons and transmission lines and other energy infrastructure we need. So that's got to be part of the conversation. But I think people get this, right? They know we need to go quickly on this. They know it's going to stabilize and bring down bills in most ways. So I think we can bring them along with us, but we have to tell that story in a really clear and positive way.
Great, thanks, Liam. Demand reduction is all too often forgotten in these debates. Moving on now to Lydia. Lydia, the new Secretary of State and Labour in its manifesto have said some welcome things about nature, not sort of that they're going to introduce lots of new stuff, but they're actually going to deliver the statutory targets, which is quite a heavy lift anyway. They've also said lots of reassuring things about farming, and we know that many farmers are in deep financial trouble, and the change from the Common Agricultural Policy to the environmental land management schemes is leaving many out of pocket. There's bad weather, etc., etc. But farming is going to have to change in order to deliver the nature targets. Are you confident the government's going to be able to reconcile those two things, commitment to nature, commitment to farmers?
So I think we've often heard these two things pitted against each other, as if we can either have a secure food supply or a thriving natural world. But really, I think we've got to move past that, because we know that when the natural world is in a bad state, so is food production. Farmers will tell you they're already feeling the impacts of climate change. So it's just not the case that we can have one without the other. And what we're seeing is that farm businesses are diversifying into environmental delivery to the point where that now constitutes a really important part of their income. If you take cereal farms last year, on average, income fell by 78%, which is obviously a huge amount, mostly because of poor weather. And in that year, over half, on average, of those cereal farm incomes came from agri-environment schemes that pay farms to deliver public goods like carbon sequestration and like nature. So creating more opportunity for farms to restore nature and improve the environment will actually create more income, and crucially, that's income, as we've seen in that very wet year last year, that will be there no matter what the weather is doing. So really, this is the route to resilient farm businesses. I think it's crucial that this is an area where there is budget to be spent. There's about £1 billion that this year will go out under the old policy that is being phased out by 2027, and that needs to be phased back in through the environmental land management scheme, the new farming policy. And that will require this government to move quite quickly in order to spend that money within that time period. And that's really essential, both because we've got this target to halt nature's decline by 2030, and also because, as you say, farm incomes are changing a lot because we're losing the old policy, and because the weather is impacting profits. And I think we haven't seen any detail from this new government on how they intend to do that. We've seen Labour commit to producing a land use framework, which I think is really important, because we need to get much more strategic about where we're investing. We still do need to produce a lot of food, so it doesn't make sense, for example, to put your woodland on the most productive land, whereas the areas that struggle to make a good income on food should be the first in the queue in order to access those schemes. Currently, the two most ambitious farming schemes aren't open for application. Farms can't get into them, and that's something that this government will rapidly need to resolve. So I think we need that land use framework to give a spatial approach that means that we can optimize a lot more in terms of where we're spending money, to make sure we've got the right things in the right places, and also look at whether the incentives available are right, and whether we're getting enough of the actions that we need. We know that woodland creation and peat restoration are behind the rates that are required for our climate targets, but for our nature targets too. And so we need to look at how do we best support farmers to do that, and are the incentives good enough, essentially. I think it's worth talking about water pollution, which was a big election issue, but mainly from a water company perspective. But we know that about half of the pollution into our waterways does arise from agriculture, and the number of livestock in the country are a big problem to that. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how readily the government looks to have to make changes in terms of water pollution arising from farming as well. And we expect that to be a key part of what they're looking to incentivize through that agricultural policy. I think as well, with a new government, there's going to be different focuses and different arguments that are going to have weight. And I think we should make the most of that, thinking about farming is the major place where we can make positive change for nature, because most of this country is farmed. Farmers are the ones that are looking after that land. But I think we have to look at what we're eating as well. We know that healthier diets are better for the environment, and so I think we should be looking to really address on the demand side of things as well, in order to make progress on our nature and broader environmental commitments. We've also, as has been mentioned, seen that willingness to step more up to an international stage on this agenda. And so with COP16 later this year, the biodiversity COP in Colombia, we really want to see this government get out of the starting blocks rapidly, so that they can go to that in a really ambitious place on this agenda. Thank you.
Thanks, Lydia. I'm going to ask a follow-up in a moment, but just to remind everyone that if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A and put a thumbs up against the questions you like most, and we'll ask them in a minute. And also don't forget to tweet, if you do tweet, at #GA event. But Lydia, when you talk about food and diet, I just wonder, shouldn't the government just dust off Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy and implement it, all that work that was done?
Yeah, I think there's loads of great work in that would be incredibly pertinent still. I think the work on that in terms of the junk food cycle and how that's where supermarkets make the highest profits, and so we're stuck in this place where people can't afford healthier diets. So yeah, I think that should be something that should be looked at right away.
Great, thank you. So let's go to some of the audience questions. I think this is probably one for Holly. How can groups work better with other sectors? And the examples given here is working with breast cancer charities who are campaigning against pesticides, but there are obviously many, there's many other sectors as well. And then Libby.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think probably what a new parliament offers us is a bit of an opportunity to reset on how we work together to influence government. And I think it's a really valid point that probably the last, it's the last 10 years or so, I think the environmental sector has felt quite siloed, forcibly so, because we haven't been winning on a lot of our issues, and it has been politically incredibly difficult. I think if we have a government that is trying to enact that over the next 6 months to a year, in a sense, we should have a bit of breathing space to really reassess how we can best work across, and that is very much cross sector. And I know that there's a lot of chat obviously about how civil society and business can interact, because business are going to be absolutely central to this. But I think the question is completely right, that it does go across other types of civil society organizations as well. And I think, well, like the breast cancer question is a particularly interesting one, and I think there are lots of opportunities for that. And I think probably what we have is a bit of an opportunity in the next year to think about that. So maybe a bit of a plea, if people have got ideas, to reach out to people in places like Green Alliance and civil society more generally about how we can better coordinate and be more strategic in the way that we engage.
Just to add,
Libby, yeah, come in.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think even with the challenging circumstances we had with the previous administration, we did see in lots of instances that joint working could be incredibly powerful. Green Alliance works with campaigners on fuel poverty, on warm this winter, because so often there are linkages between what we want to see and what other parts of civil society want to see. And so that campaign's obviously calling for things like energy efficiency and greater renewables, because it will serve both of those means. And just a sort of personal example, the one big win that we had under in the recent years under Conservative administration in the resources theme at Green Alliance was getting the ban on single-use vapes, which actually did fall. So Labour does need to bring that back in. But the ban was brought through in large part because we worked really closely with children's health. People campaigners on that side of things and on cancer and on just health in general. And we worked with the Royal College of Pediatrics and Children's Health, and they were calling for a ban just like we were. And I think that moral authority that came from the children's health people really pushed it over the line, even though I think that the case for banning disposable vapes from an environmental perspective was strong enough on its own, but jointly working together was really quite powerful. And I think it would be great if we could see more instances of that. And on the issue of pesticides and breast cancer, that is something where I do know that civil society from the environment sector and also from health charities, they do talk a lot together. And during the Brexit period, when we were in the process of leaving the EU's world-leading chemical regime, those two sides were both talking to people like Sue Hayman, who was the Shadow Secretary of State at the time and has just been appointed as a junior minister in DEFRA. And she was quite strong on the need for proper chemicals regulation. So we don't know what her brief is going to be, but whoever has that brief in DEFRA will hopefully be receptive to the sort of joint calls for action and where that has benefits for health as well as for the environment.
Great, thank you. Let's move on. Quite an edgy question here, which I'm going to direct firstly to Liam. How should the sector work with the Green Party? There's been a natural tendency to assume that they are on side with all outcomes, which has proven already to be a mistake given the party's apparent stance on building onshore wind and HS2.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Shaun and Helena, for the question. I think the Green Party, but also the government itself and us as NGOs, we have to tread a very careful line that navigates between the local concerns and maybe nature and biodiversity concerns and those huge national priorities, which can be hard to kind of conceptualize and visualize on a local level, but are really critical. So I think Green Party and others have to take people on that journey that gives them that positive vision of what we're building on a national scale and why, and not to get completely overwhelmed by what can sometimes be quite small but vocal opposition that sometimes is very well grounded and sometimes it isn't. So I think there's definitely a role for us to support, I think actually all the opposition parties, to navigate that carefully. But my caution to the new Green MPs and others would be, don't slip into that trap of saying no to anything that has a local impact, because I think it will jeopardize the credibility on a national level as well, to navigate this. And it is a sticky problem. It's a tricky problem. And, Shaun, you'll have some views on this as well, I think. But we've got to build a lot of things and we've got to build them quickly, but let's do it in a way that brings people with us and minimizes those impacts where possible. I'm sure we can do better than the previous systems, but there's a balance. And I think perhaps some of the messaging from the government, the Labour Party has got people worried, about talks about bulldozing the planning system is not the right kind of narrative, I think, to take people with you. So there's got to be a balance. But yeah, it's a tough question. I don't think I've got a perfect answer. So I'm interested in your views as well, Shaun.
Thanks, Liam. Well, I certainly think we're going to need to build a lot of stuff to achieve, both to tackle the housing crisis and to decarbonise power, and landscapes are going to change. But I do think also that planning is an instrument for delivering those things and getting public consent. And it's really unhelpful to talk always about bulldozing the planning system and talking about planning as a constraint. We've actually had 14 years of simplification, liberalisation, dissing planning departments, and it really hasn't worked. And I was slightly worried that after Rachel Reeves's first Treasury speech, all the people who welcomed it were all the people who caused such mayhem in the planning system for the last 14 years. So I think a reset on planning to get the infrastructure and housing we need with public consent is what's needed, rather than seeing planning always as the impediment. But that's just that's my 2 penny worth. Let's move on to the anybody could take this, but it might be another one for you, Liam. I'm just going to the next most voted question. And I haven't seen any serious talk about how we're going to develop a buildings workforce capable of delivering net zero carbon refurbishment of our homes. And it refers to the task force that the last government set up and then summarily stood down last September when Rishi Sunak did his rollback on net zero. How should this government tackle that, Liam?
Yeah, another great question without an easy answer, I'm afraid, and it's something that I think we at Green Alliance will be doing much more thinking on over the course of this year and beyond. And so mostly that's a kind of holding answer to say, we've got to keep thinking about it. But yeah, I mean, absolutely right. Those recommendations from the task force need to be picked up, and hopefully, I think the positive of this change of government is that the new government will have stronger links with the unions that hopefully will be part of shaping that that trajectory forwards. But crucially, the number one thing that we really need to see is long-term stable policy in this area, because I think many people will know about the real challenges with previous building retrofit schemes that were very stop-start, very spiky in terms of funding, and that very, very clearly didn't work. So it's got to be something with a long-term vision and stable funding and support, so that the industry can build and blossom and then deliver over a number of years, rather than trying to ship out all the money in 1 year and it all going wrong. So that's the number one thing. But I think watch this space for more thoughts, and of course we're always open to hearing from others who have answers that they've already come to. So yeah.
I just think reinforces again quite what a big in tray the government has got, and the whole skills agenda is one that the last government had a green jobs delivery group which was doing great work but didn't complete before the election, and that's the whole skills agenda also needs to be picked up. But Libby, did you want to come in on this?
I was just going to say the exact same thing as Liam, that we've seen chopping and changing, and we haven't had a clear message from government on retrofitting, on renovation, and that has really hampered the development of long-term supply chains. And I think actually some of the recent changes we've seen to planning policy have hindered that as well, because it's made it easier to tear down an existing building if the purpose for the new building is for housing. And so that's sending a message that you don't want to see retrofitting and renovation, as is actually the sort of perversity of the current tax system, which zero rates new build and charges normally 20% on any renovation and renovation activities. And if we want to send a signal that the best building, the lowest carbon building in not all instances, but in many instances, is the one that already exists, we do need to look at all of the different drivers and have clarity and a message for the long term that's what we want to see.
Thank you. A question now for Lydia and anybody else who wants to take it. It's from Adrian Phillips. Will the nature agenda get as much attention as the climate change one, and how can we encourage the government to give it as much attention? And I guess this also relates to the whole mission-based government, where there is a mission of clean power. There's no mission on nature.
Yeah, so I mean, the answer to the first question is it is at this point unlikely to get as much attention as the climate change one, which is why the second part of the question is so important. I think the way to do this isn't to talk about nature in an abstract sense, because actually what nature degradation is doing is meaning that our rivers are in a terrible state and people can't use them to do the things that they want to do in them. We've got so much flooding because we don't have upstream wetlands that are able to hold lots of water because they're being managed in ways that don't allow that, either for grouse shooting or whatever else. So I think we have to frame this around things that actually impact people's lives. We know that people care a lot about the green spaces very near to where they live. We know that people go to national parks a lot, and that those are key places that people go and visit. So how can we talk about changing those places to have much more nature in them in a way that the public really resonate with, and enable that to capture more attention in government as well. I think that the more, as time goes on, we've got businesses really wanting to invest in nature in a way that the carbon offset market grew rapidly sometime before this. And that's both huge opportunity and huge challenge, because at the moment we've got supermarkets rushing to produce X amount of their food by whatever date through regenerative agriculture, but there's no agreed thing there's no agreed definition or agreed measurement or verification of what that really means. So I think that's a place where we really need to be looking to rapidly put some guardrails on that. And yeah, so I think that's the key, is to talk about it in ways that really affects people's lives, whether that's through the food that they eat or the places that they visit, or the things right around where they live.
But for politicians, Lydia, do you think, and this may be a question for Holly or others as well, do you think politicians think of nature as a political issue, or just something they engage with at the weekends?
I think we've spent a long time thinking about about retail policies, because we were heading into an election, which, yeah, I suppose was trying to get politicians to think about nature as more than a nice to have, and to think about the ways in which people care about it, and therefore they should care about it. I think there is a big education piece to be done in terms of how the nature crisis is as great a challenge to be overcome as the climate crisis, which I think has just received so much more attention. And so roles that organisations like Green Alliance have to play in that, with the boot camps that we're running for new MPs, I think are really important, because there is just a lot less knowledge about it. I think nature's been in decline for actually a really long time, and we've almost normalised that. There's almost an expectation that there's less and less nature around, and therefore it's sort of almost to be expected. So I think yeah, there's a big challenge to shift that thinking from this is a nice to have thing, and to really show that it's essential to a well-functioning economy.
Thanks, Lydia. Libby, were you coming in?
Yeah, I was just going to say that there have been instances in the recent past when nature has been more political, and that tends to be things like the Blue Planet effect, where there are charismatic megafauna that you can see being really, really damaged in the natural environment. What we haven't been good at probably is sort of parlaying that into more wider concern for the natural environment. And I think that is possible, that should be possible. And if we should be able to do things like make the link between really high levels of consumption in the UK and the destruction of really precious natural environments abroad, as well as talking about our own natural environment. But I don't think that we've managed to get that framing across and to really make that connection. But I hope that it will be possible.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it was certainly impressive to see the big nature march before the election, which has never happened before. One last question, and probably for Holly, about framing. The focus of Rachel Reeves's focus is productivity as a route to more and better jobs. I think I've taken this down wrong. But as a route to addressing the underlying dissatisfaction of many voters, how can we frame our work, not in terms of climate and nature, but in terms of high quality jobs in all regions, say?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that, well, there's many ways to answer that question. I think our relationship with the unions is particularly important in action on climate. The central part of action on climate has to be to do with fairness, and it has to be to do with action on industries and jobs of the future that will make a massive difference to communities. And if there's one thing that we learn from past transitions in this country, but also across the world, it's that has to be done right in order for there to be a future of a very great number of industries and jobs. And I think that's something that both the government is going to come under a lot of pressure over, and so is the environmental sector, because they're two things that are incredibly hard to necessarily pin together if you're matching both the scale of the challenge and the pace at which change needs to happen with the messaging, as you say, on jobs and the impact of people now, for people to be brought along with you. So I think probably actually answer that question is like across all of the things that we've talked about today. And actually one of the key things for me is like thinking about where those pitfalls might be for a government in the next 5 years and how we can shape messaging in a useful way around that. So I think that there are lots of things that if you look at their promises on GB Energy and building infrastructure, actually that's done with a central promise of creating jobs, and they will see their arguments vindicated, particularly in Scotland, where they've won obviously a huge number of seats on a very bold oil and gas platform. But the other flip side of that is that it will take a long time to build the infrastructure that is needed for all of those things, and it's impossible for that to be done in the next parliament. And from a political point of view, I think that the new government can only be too aware that they are going to be facing some major challenges when actually people's bills don't come down incredibly quickly, because actually we haven't built the stuff yet. That will come, and the example, like, you know, it's absolutely proven that renewables will be cheaper and will be, the energy security argument is very valid. But I think it all comes down to the same framing and how we as a sector need to play a better part in linking up all of those different arguments.
Great, thanks, Holly, and probably as a sector getting behind good unionised jobs as well, because if unions are losing good quality jobs in fossil fuel sector, they're less likely to support the transition. Rapid one sentence answers right at the end. I'm going to go in the reverse order this time, just to say, starting with Lydia, looking back from 2029, 5 years time, what's the one thing that you really hope this government in your area will have achieved?
I hope that people will be eating healthier diets, because that has to, if we don't change what we're eating, then any changes we make to our farm landscape here will just shift production overseas. So I hope that's the one thing that we managed to do.
Great, thank you. I've forgotten the order now. Liam.
Yeah, thanks, Shaun. Well, you won't be surprised to hear me say that I hope we'll be on the cusp of almost clean zero carbon power in the UK. I'm not sure we'll be quite there at very, very much zero, but if we're almost there and we're building just that last 5%, that would be fantastic.
Thanks, Liam. Libby.
I would be so happy if the government would have committed to One Planet resource use, to bringing in a target and getting towards the target to bring our material footprint down to what the science says is sustainable, replicating the sort of approach that we've taken with climate change, looking at what the science says is needed, and then putting in place the targets and the plans to get there.
Great, thank you. Holly.
Mine is that we've succeeded at bringing the public along with us on the importance of action on climate, and that it has not been a culture war issue over the last 5 years in the way that it has been in the five years preceding it.
Brilliant. Thank you all. All eminently achievable wish lists. And thanks very much to the panelists. Thanks to Siri for organising, Emily for fielding the questions, and to everybody who's tuned in. And do look out for the next Green Alliance webinar, which will be next Thursday, where we'll be interviewing Tom Heap, journalist Tom Heap, about his new book, Land Smart, a really fascinating book about land use. So thanks all very much indeed.